The 18th of April, 1942, Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle sat in the cockpit of a B-25 bomber on the deck of the USS Hornet, preparing to attempt something that aviation experts said was impossible, taking off from an aircraft carrier in a plane that was never designed for carrier operations. His destination was Tokyo, the heart of the Japanese Empire, in a mission that would either boost American morale or end in complete disaster. Doolittle knew that even if his raid succeeded, none of his 16 aircraft would have enough fuel to return to the carrier. They would all crash in China or be shot down over Japan. But 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America needed a victory, and Doolittle was willing to sacrifice his life to deliver it. What happened next became known as the Doolittle Raid, 30 seconds over Tokyo that changed the course of World War II. This incredible story is completely true, every detail verified by military records and witness testimonies. If you love hearing about real heroes like this, make sure to subscribe. We share these amazing true stories regularly. What makes Jimmy Doolittle's story so extraordinary isn't just the audacity of bombing Japan from an aircraft carrier. It is that he volunteered for a mission he knew was a suicide run. Doolittle was already a famous aviator and test pilot who had broken speed records and pioneered instrument flying techniques. At 45 years old, he could have spent the war safely training other pilots or developing new aircraft technology. Instead, he volunteered for the most dangerous mission of the Pacific War, leading 16 B-25 bombers off a carrier deck, bombing Japan, then crash, landing in occupied China with virtually no chance of rescue. The mission was so risky that President Roosevelt himself had to approve it personally. Military planners estimated that casualties would be 100%. Meaning every pilot and crew member would either be killed or captured. But Doolittle believed that America needed a psychological victory more than it needed 80 airmen, even if it cost him his life. James Harold Doolittle was born on the 14th of December, 1896, in Alameda, California, into a world where powered flight was still a novelty that most people had never witnessed. His childhood was marked by constant movement as his family searched for economic opportunities during the economic uncertainties of the early 1900s. Jimmy's fascination with mechanical devices and speed became apparent early in his life. He built his own soapbox racers, experimented with engines and motors, and displayed the kind of fearless attitude toward dangerous machinery that would later make him famous as an aviator. When World War I began, Jimmy was a student at the University of California, Berkeley, studying mining engineering. But the excitement of military aviation drew him away from his studies, and in 1917 he enlisted in the Signal Officers Reserve Corps to become a pilot. Jimmy's timing was unfortunate for seeing combat in World War I. He completed his flight training just as the war ended, denying him the combat experience that many of his contemporaries gained in France. But this delay allowed him to focus on the technical aspects of aviation that would define his later career. During the 1920s, Jimmy established himself as one of America's premier test pilots and aviation innovators. He was the first pilot to perform outside loops, won the Schneider Trophy race in 1925, and set numerous speed records that captured public attention and advanced aviation technology. Jimmy's most significant contribution to aviation came in 1929, when he became the first pilot to perform a completely blind flight, taking off, navigating and landing using only instruments without any visual reference to the ground. This achievement revolutionized aviation safety and made commercial airline travel practical in all weather conditions. But Jimmy's greatest fame came from his racing exploits. In 1932, he won the Thompson Trophy race at an average speed of over 250 miles per hour, establishing himself as the fastest pilot in the world and demonstrating that American aviation technology could compete with any nation. Throughout the 1930s, Jimmy worked for Shell Oil Company, developing aviation fuels and testing new aircraft designs. His technical expertise and reputation for handling dangerous experimental aircraft made him invaluable to both commercial and military aviation development. When World War II began in Europe, Jimmy was serving as a major in the Army Air Corps Reserve while continuing his civilian career as a test pilot and aviation consultant. At 44 years old, he could have easily remained in a safe technical role throughout the war. But Jimmy had always been drawn to challenges that others considered impossible. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, He immediately requested active duty and began lobbying for assignment to combat operations. Jimmy's opportunity came in January 1942, when military planners were desperately seeking ways to strike back at Japan and boost American morale after the disasters at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. President Roosevelt had specifically requested options for bombing the Japanese home islands, even if such missions were extremely risky. The problem seemed insurmountable. American air bases in the Pacific had been captured or destroyed, and no existing bomber had the range to reach Japan from available bases and return safely. Conventional military wisdom said that bombing Japan was impossible until American forces could capture bases closer to the Japanese home islands. But Jimmy Doolittle saw possibilities that others missed. Working with Navy Captain Francis Lowe and Admiral William Halsey, he developed a plan that aviation experts considered insane: launch Army B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier, bomb Japanese cities, then continue to airfields in China where the planes could land and the crews could be evacuated. The plan required modifying B-25 bombers for carrier operations, training Army pilots for naval takeoffs, and coordinating with Chinese forces who might or might not be able to provide assistance after the raid. Most critically, it required airmen willing to volunteer for a mission with virtually no chance of survival. When Jimmy was offered command of the mission, he accepted immediately, even though it meant giving up his safe technical role for what amounted to a suicide mission. At 45 years old, he was about to attempt the most audacious air raid in military history, knowing that success would require everything he had learned about flying, leadership, and calculated risk-taking during his 25-year aviation career. Jimmy Doolittle's first challenge was transforming Army Air Corps pilots into carrier aviators, capable of taking off from a ship deck in aircraft that were never designed for such operations. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a twin-engine aircraft weighing over 30,000 pounds when fully loaded, far heavier than any plane that had ever taken off from a carrier. The training began at Eglin Field in Florida, where Jimmy and his volunteers practiced short takeoff techniques, using a runway marked to simulate the length of a carrier deck. The B-25s had to become airborne in less than 500 feet, a distance that barely provided margin for error. Jimmy selected his crews carefully, looking for pilots with exceptional skill, steady nerves, and the kind of aggressive confidence that would be necessary for such a dangerous mission. He needed men who could handle both the technical challenges of carrier takeoffs and the psychological pressure of knowing they were volunteering for what amounted to a one-way trip. The training was intensive and dangerous. Several aircraft were damaged during practice takeoffs, and crews had to learn completely new techniques for managing heavy bombers in situations no one had ever attempted before. Jimmy participated in every training exercise, demonstrating the techniques himself and showing his crews that their commander was willing to take the same risks he was asking of them. But the technical challenges were only part of the preparation. The B-25s had to be modified extensively for the mission. Additional fuel tanks were installed to extend their range. Defensive armament was removed to save weight, and special navigation equipment was added for the long overwater flight to Japan. Jimmy worked closely with Navy personnel to coordinate the carrier operations that would be necessary for the mission's success. The USS Hornet would carry 16 B-25s on her deck, positioning them for launch at a point approximately 400 miles from the Japanese coast, close enough for the bombers to reach their targets, but far enough to avoid the strongest Japanese defenses. The coordination between Army and Navy personnel was unprecedented and required careful planning to ensure that two services with different procedures and equipment could work together effectively. Jimmy's diplomatic skills and technical expertise were crucial in resolving the inevitable conflicts between Army aviation doctrine and Navy carrier operations. Security for the mission was absolutely critical. If Japanese intelligence learned about the planned raid, they could position fighters and anti-aircraft defenses to destroy the attacking bombers before they reached their targets. The entire training program was conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy, with cover stories and false documentation to conceal the mission's true purpose. Jimmy's crews were told only that they were preparing for a dangerous overseas mission that would require exceptional flying skills. The specific targets and mission details were revealed only after the USS Hornet had sailed from San Francisco and was beyond the reach of potential intelligence leaks. On the 2nd of April, 1942, the modified B-25s were loaded aboard the USS Hornet at the Alameda Naval Air Station. Jimmy's final selection included 80 volunteers, 16 pilots, 16 co-pilots, 16 bombardiers, 16 navigators, and 16 gunners, all of whom had trained for weeks without knowing their ultimate destination. As the Hornet sailed toward Japan, Jimmy spent his time reviewing target information, weather forecasts, and coordination procedures with Chinese forces who were supposed to assist the raiders after they bombed Japan and continued to airfields in unoccupied China. But Jimmy also knew that many variables were beyond his control. The success of the mission would depend on weather conditions, Japanese defensive reactions, and the ability of his crews to navigate over 600 miles of ocean to find targets they had studied only in photographs and maps. Most critically, the mission's success would depend on reaching the launch point undetected. If Japanese forces discovered the American carrier task force before the bombers could take off, the entire raid would be canceled, and a year of planning would be wasted. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle prepared for the most important takeoff of his aviation career. In just a few hours, he would either lead the first American attack on the Japanese home island since the war began, or he would die in the attempt. At 45 years old, after 25 years of pushing the boundaries of aviation technology, Jimmy was about to discover whether all his experience with impossible flying challenges had prepared him for the ultimate test of pilot skill and courage. At 558 hours on the 18th of April, 1942, lookouts aboard the USS Hornet spotted Japanese picket boats approximately 650 miles from the Japanese coast. The American task force had been detected earlier than planned, forcing Admiral Halsey to make a crucial decision: launch the raid immediately or abort the mission entirely. Jimmy Doolittle was informed that the launch would begin at 0800 hours, nearly 200 miles farther from Japan than originally planned. This meant his bombers would have even less fuel for the mission, making the chances of reaching safe airfields in China virtually impossible. But Jimmy knew that this might be America's only chance to strike back at Japan for months or even years. The psychological impact of bombing Japanese cities would be enormous, regardless of whether his crews survived the mission. Jimmy made final preparations for takeoff from his position as the first aircraft in line. His B-25 loaded with 4,500-pound bombs destined for Tokyo represented months of planning and training. As the mission commander, he would lead by example, taking the most dangerous position and demonstrating to his crews that their leader was willing to share every risk of the mission. The takeoff sequence began at 0820 hours when Jimmy released his brakes and pushed his throttles to maximum power. The heavily loaded B-25 lumbered down the carrier deck, struggling to gain flying speed as salt spray from the carrier's bow wave peppered his windscreen. Jimmy's aircraft cleared the carrier deck with only feet to spare, dropping toward the ocean surface before slowly climbing away from the task force. Behind him, 15 more B-25s followed at 5-minute intervals, each crew facing the same desperate struggle to become airborne from the short carrier deck. The flight to Japan took nearly 5 hours over empty ocean, with navigation requiring dead reckoning techniques that allowed no margin for error. Jimmy's crews had to maintain radio silence to avoid detection, making coordination impossible once the aircraft were airborne. Jimmy's formation reached the Japanese coast at approximately 12:30 hours, finding weather conditions that provided excellent visibility for bombing, but also made the attacking aircraft clearly visible to Japanese defenders. Anti-aircraft fire began immediately, but most Japanese gunners were unprepared for the sudden appearance of American bombers over their homeland. Jimmy's target was the Kachidoki district of Tokyo, home to military facilities and industrial plants that supported the Japanese war effort. His approach was made at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection and improve bombing accuracy, but this also exposed his aircraft to small arms fire from the ground. The bombing run over Tokyo lasted approximately 30 seconds, with Jimmy's bombardier releasing 4,500-pound bombs on industrial targets before the B-25 climbed away from the city. Japanese fighters were scrambling to intercept the attackers, but Jimmy's surprise approach had given him a crucial time advantage. After bombing Tokyo, Jimmy faced the longest and most dangerous part of his mission, The 600-mile flight to airfields in unoccupied China with rapidly diminishing fuel supplies. Weather conditions were deteriorating, and radio communication with Chinese forces was impossible due to language barriers and equipment problems. Jimmy's aircraft, like most of the other B-25s, began running low on fuel long before reaching the Chinese coast. As darkness fell and weather conditions worsened, it became clear that normal landings at prepared airfields would be impossible for most of the raiding aircraft. Jimmy made the decision to continue flying toward China until his fuel was exhausted, then order his crew to bail out over what he hoped would be friendly territory. It was exactly the kind of calculated risk that had defined his entire aviation career, accepting certain immediate danger to achieve a larger objective. Approximately 21-30 hours with his fuel tanks nearly empty, and flying blind in bad weather over mountainous terrain, Jimmy ordered his crew to abandon the aircraft. One by one, the 5 crew members jumped into the darkness, not knowing whether they would land in territory controlled by Chinese allies or Japanese occupiers. Jimmy was the last to leave his aircraft, following the pilot's tradition of ensuring his crew's safety before his own. As he jumped into the stormy night over China, he had no way of knowing whether his mission had succeeded or whether any of his 79 fellow raiders had survived their own crash landings. But Jimmy Doolittle had accomplished something that military experts had declared impossible. He had led American bombers in a successful attack on the Japanese home islands, demonstrating that no target was beyond the reach of American air power. In 30 seconds over Tokyo, he had struck a psychological blow against Japanese morale that would resonate throughout the Pacific War. Jimmy Doolittle landed hard in a Chinese rice paddy during a thunderstorm, injured, but alive after bailing out of his fuel, exhausted B-25. For the next several days, he wandered through mountainous terrain in occupied China, not knowing whether he had landed in friendly or enemy territory, or whether any of his fellow raiders had survived their own crash landings. Jimmy's rescue came through the heroic efforts of Chinese civilians and guerrilla fighters who risked their lives to help American airmen evade Japanese patrols. Despite the language barriers and the constant danger of capture, Chinese resistance members guided Jimmy to safety and provided medical care for his injuries. Over the following weeks, Jimmy learned the fate of his raid and his crews. Of the 16 B-25s that had launched from the USS Hornet, 15 had crashed in China or been shot down over Japan. Only one aircraft had managed to land at a Soviet airfield, where the crew was immediately interned. The human cost of the raid was significant, but less than the 100% casualties that planners had predicted. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces, with 3 later executed as war criminals. Jimmy and most of his surviving crews were eventually evacuated from China with the help of Chinese resistance fighters and American intelligence operatives. But the strategic impact of the Doolittle raid far exceeded its modest physical damage to Japanese facilities. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces had struck back at Japan, proving that the Japanese home islands were not invulnerable to attack. The psychological effect on Japanese morale was devastating. The sudden appearance of American bombers over Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and other cities shattered the Japanese people's confidence in their military's ability to protect the homeland. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the attack on Pearl Harbor, was destroyed in a single afternoon. More importantly, the raid forced Japanese military leaders to make strategic decisions that ultimately weakened their position in the Pacific. Fearing additional American air attacks, they recalled fighter squadrons from front-line operations to defend the home islands, reducing Japanese air power in critical areas like the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The Doolittle raid also influenced Japanese strategy in ways that proved disastrous for their war effort. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, became convinced that Japan needed to destroy the remaining American carrier fleet before additional raids could be launched against Japanese cities. This strategic imperative led directly to the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where Japanese forces suffered their first major defeat of the Pacific War. Yamamoto's decision to seek a decisive naval battle was motivated largely by his determination to prevent additional Doolittle-style raids on Japan. For American morale, the psychological impact of the raid was enormous. After months of defeats and retreats throughout the Pacific, Americans finally had a victory to celebrate. The image of Jimmy Doolittle leading bombers off a carrier deck to attack Japan captured the American imagination and demonstrated that the United States was capable of striking back at its enemies. President Roosevelt, when asked by reporters where the bombers had come from, famously replied that they had flown from Shangri-La, a reference to the fictional paradise in the novel Lost Horizon. The joke became part of American folklore and helped maintain the security classification that protected operational details of the raid. Jimmy returned to the United States as a national hero, promoted to brigadier general, and awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership of the raid. But characteristically, he insisted that the real heroes were the Chinese civilians who had risked their lives to help American airmen escape from occupied territory. Jimmy spent the remainder of World War II commanding air forces in North Africa and Europe, where he applied the same innovative thinking and aggressive leadership that had made the Tokyo raid successful. His tactical innovations and willingness to lead from the front contributed significantly to Allied air superiority in both theaters. But Jimmy's greatest legacy remained the raid that bore his name. The Doolittle raid proved that American ingenuity and courage could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that individual initiative could change the course of history. Years after the war, when historians analyzed the strategic impact of various military operations, the Doolittle raid stood out as an example of how small forces could achieve disproportionate results through careful planning, exceptional leadership, and the willingness to accept enormous personal risks. Jimmy Doolittle died in 1993 at the age of 96, having lived long enough to see his raid recognized as one of the turning points of World War II. His funeral was attended by survivors of the raid, military leaders, and ordinary Americans who remembered the psychological boost his mission had provided during the darkest period of the Pacific War. The annual reunions of Doolittle raiders continued for decades after the war, with surviving crew members gathering to remember their fallen comrades and celebrate their shared experience of participating in one of the most audacious military operations in history. The final reunion took place in 2013, when the last surviving raiders were too elderly to continue their tradition. Jimmy Doolittle's story reminds us that sometimes the most important victories are psychological rather than physical. His raid inflicted minimal damage on Japanese facilities, but it fundamentally changed how both sides viewed the Pacific War. Doolittle proved that American innovation and courage could overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it seemed to conventional military thinking. His willingness to volunteer for a suicide mission demonstrated the kind of leadership that inspires others to attempt the impossible. The raid also showed how individual initiative can alter the course of history. Doolittle's 30 seconds over Tokyo led directly to Japanese strategic mistakes that contributed to their ultimate defeat in the Pacific War. Most importantly, Doolittle's story illustrates the power of never accepting that something cannot be done. When military experts said bombing Japan was impossible, he found a way to make it possible. When others calculated 100% casualties, he found ways to minimize losses while maximizing impact. What do you think motivated Doolittle to volunteer for a mission he knew was essentially suicide? Was it patriotism, professional pride, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. If stories of impossible missions accomplished through courage and innovation inspire you, subscribe for more incredible true tales from history's greatest military moments. Remember Jimmy Doolittle's example: when others say something is impossible, that is often when it is most worth attempting.